Okay, second 9, objective 9's on the quadratic formula. It's kind of a review from Algebra 1, but we never spent a whole lot of time on it in Algebra 1. So the quadratic formula says if we have ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, then x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Again, we use the quadratic formula to kind of find the zeros. Now I know in the last objective we just used technology to find the zeros. Sometimes that technology is not available, so we have to have a way to solve these if the square root method doesn't work or if factoring doesn't work. So that's where the quadratic formula would come in to play. Main thing is we got 0 on one side, so then we can identify a as the number in front of x squared, b as the number in front of x, and c as the constant at the end. Now what I would recommend doing when you're writing this stuff out to work it out is wherever there's a letter, I'm going to put a parentheses before I even begin. So in other words, I would write x equals negative, put a parentheses for the b, plus or minus square root, put a parentheses for b and then squared, minus 4, parentheses for a and parentheses for c, all over 2 and then a parentheses for a. Now we can go back and substitute for each letter. So b goes in the first parentheses and the second parentheses, and b is 3 in this case. A goes here and here, and a happens to also be 3. And c goes in the last parentheses on top, which is negative 2. Now when you go to work this out, and there are some steps that you can probably kind of combine, and I'll try to show this in as little steps as possible. So we'd have x equals, since this is a negative of a positive, that's going to stay negative 3, plus or minus, then we got the square root. I usually like to go back up here and say, okay, well, 3 squared is 9. I treat this as a negative 4. Negative 4 times 3 times negative 2. Negative 4 times 3 is negative 12. Times negative 2 is 24. And I'm going to combine those two. So 9 and 24 is 33. All over 2 times 3 is 6. Now one of two things is going to happen. This square root will either be something that we can simplify or know the square root of, or something that can't be simplified. So in other words, there's not a perfect square that goes into 33. So if there's not a perfect square that goes into that, and I'll do one that has one here in a second, then we would just leave this as our answer. So again, that means we technically have two answers, one at negative 3 plus the square root of 33 over 6, and the other at negative 3 minus the square root of 33 over 6. So if I look at the second example, 2x squared minus 6x minus 10 equals 0. So again, a would be 2 in this case, b would be negative 6, c would be negative 10. So writing out the quadratic formula with parentheses, x equals negative, parentheses for b, plus or minus the square root of parentheses for b squared, minus 4 parentheses for a and c, all over 2 and then a parentheses for a. So again, b goes in the first two parentheses, which in this case is negative 6. A is 2, so it's going to go here and here. And c is negative 10, so we got that. So then I have x equals, here since I have a negative, that becomes a positive 6, plus or minus the square root. Negative 6 squared means negative 6 times negative 6, which is positive 36. Negative 4 times 2 is negative 8, times negative 10 is positive 80. So 36 and 80 is 116. All over 2 times 2 is 4. Now, the square root of 116, I mean, it may not be recognizable right at the bat, but I can break down the square root of 116 because 4 goes into that. Now you may say, well, how do you know 4 goes into that? Well, there is a shortcut. If 4 goes into the last 2 numbers of a number, then it goes into the whole thing. You don't have to memorize that. That's just a little rule. So I can break this down to the square root of 4 times the square root of 29. Well, the square root of 4 is 2, and then I have the square root of 29 left over. So you may say, well, how does that help me simplify it? Well, I would write this then as x equals 6 plus or minus 2 times the square root of 29 over 4. Now the last bit of simplifying you can do, if there's a number that goes into all 3 of these, so the 6, the number in front of the square root, and the number at the bottom, we can factor that out. But it has to be in all 3 of them. So since 2 goes into all those, I can actually write this as 2 goes into 6 3 times, plus or minus 2 goes into 2 1 time, square root of 29. Okay, so again we got 3 plus or minus the square root of 29 over 2 is the best answer. My main concern is, can you get to here? If you get to here and you try to simplify the square root and get it wrong, I'm probably just going to help you with that, but I do want you to try to simplify the square root if possible.